Good afternoon. My talk for today delves on many aspects like military history, political and economic histories, history of ideas, but most importantly, a panoramic view of global history before the Second World War, with the Philippines at the center stage. Looking back in various narratives and studies on global history of the war itself, the lens is always about international relations, strategic studies, and military history. In this talk, I want to highlight the Philippine Commonwealth's action concerning preparedness for a possible war with Japan. But preparedness is not only measured on military strength and strategies. Michael Beckley suggests that economic development is the most critical factor to affect a state or a nation's development of military power. In his study of various battles and wars from 1898 to 1987, he suggests that the more economically developed side consistently outfought the poorer side on a soldier-for-soldier basis. The Philippine Commonwealth was in dilemma in 1935. While it achieved political independence, the next step is economic independence. However, because of militarization of Japan and their expansionist campaigns in East Asia, national defense became the top priority of the Philippine Commonwealth. In his first address to the National Assembly, Quezon argued, quote, "Self-defense is the supreme right of mankind, no more sacred to the individual than to the nation, the interests of which are immeasurable, of great significance and extent. A threat against the nation involves not alone the life of one individual, but of millions. And to ask your ungrudging support for the establishment of a sound system of national defense, this is our first and most urgent need." But Quezon recognized and admitted that it is manifestly impossible with the state of the Philippine Commonwealth to acquire a naval fleet because of economic reasons. Politically, there was evidence of resistance in the act's passing, both inside and outside the assembly. Emilio Aguinaldo, for instance, expresses dissent and suggested relying first on the United States until the Philippines was granted complete independence. And the Commonwealth should prioritize solving the country's economic problems. Inside the assembly, the leading dissenter was Camilo Osias. As a champion of state support for education, he feared a militarization of young Filipinos, and the Commonwealth's money and earnings should instead be spent on education and solving the country's problems like poverty and hunger. But the support for Quezon is formidable. Through the National Assembly, the Commonwealth Act No. 1 was signed and enacted in December of the same year, just 26 days after Quezon's inauguration. The Act's purpose was also known as the National Defense Act. It is to create an independent Philippine military. But as stated in Article 7, Section 16 of the National Defense Act, quote, "The President of the Philippines shall have authority to appoint and maintain such technical advisors from the Army of the United States," unquote. Based on Japan's attitude before and during the interwar period and the United States' fear of a possible war, and the way I interpret the quick granting of the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934 and the American support for the National Defense Act of 1935, it was an assurance that Filipinos are morally bound to defend the country in case of possible war in the Pacific, and the national defense of the Philippine Islands is not solely carried upon the colonial responsibility of the United States. Although it was economically painful for the US to give up the Philippines, it was the best strategy available militarily. National defense became a top priority, the economy only second to it through the Commonwealth Act No. 2, establishing the National Economic Council. Military historians would agree that as early as 1911, a possible war with Japan is definitely to happen. The question, however, is when. The Philippines, given its tactical location in the Pacific, the National Defense Act was precisely strategic and necessary for the US, but detrimental for the Philippines. Ever since the US occupied the Philippines, our country became a magnet of aggression of whatever war is to happen in East Asia or Southeast Asia because of the growing and the clashing Pan-Asianist sentiment and Western imperialism at the advent of the 20th century. But did Filipinos ever consider Japan a real aggressor before the war? It's pretty controversial. Following Japan's successive participation in wars beginning 1894 at the First Sino-Japanese War, quote, like any rising power, Japan was also developing an awareness of its national interests that lay far beyond its physical borders, unquote. Likewise, it was without a doubt why Bonifacio and the Katipunan sought political recognition and military help from Japan in 1896. In the words of Emilio Jacinto, Japan, quote, being the only nation in the Far East that could lend help to the Philippines in the same manner that France lent aid to the United States to secure the latter's independence, unquote. And, quote, that the light of liberty of Japan will also shed its rays in the Philippines, unquote. But when the US acquired the Philippines, it had announced its presence in Japan's neighborhood. To understand the Filipino perception of the Japanese, we trace this back to the idea of Pan-Asianism. This explains the dissenting opinion of some Filipinos to the Commonwealth's government's move to militarize the country to the National Defense Act. To begin with, Filipinos never regarded the Japanese as aggressors, in the same way the US considered them. Before the years of the Philippine Commonwealth, Filipinos had a casual yet frigid relationship with the people of Japan. Nicole Kaunyang Aboitis uncovered this in her book, Asian Place, Filipino Nation. Kaunyang Aboitis traced how, quote, the propagandists employed Japan as a symbol of current power to heighten by association the Filipino sense of their Asian civilization and Asian history, as well as to awaken national pride, unquote. This admiration for Japan was shared by different nations, not only of the Philippines, Vietnam, India, China, and Indonesia. It was not until Japan used Pan-Asianism to validate their military expansionism beginning in the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 that some of these Asian nations had a fallout. Yet from the perspective of Japan, journalist Tokotomi Soho penned this as, quote, the countries of the Far East falling prey to the great powers of Europe is something that our nation will not stand for. We have the duty to maintain peace in East Asia, unquote. At first, in the Philippines, the influx of migrants and immigrants in the islands was not seen as a threat by the Americans. The American government in the Philippines acquired the service of the Japanese. For example, in the construction of roads leading to Baguio. In Mindanao, many settled in Davao to work in abaca plantations. For the first time in Philippine migration history, the Japanese outlasted the Chinese immigrants. Many factors motivated the Japanese to migrate overseas, like overpopulation, rapid industrialization and modernization, and natural disasters. But the US remained vigilant. From Western eyes, the migrations were considered internationalist plans of Japan's national development and imperial expansion, to the point that anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States and the Philippines became a national issue. But admiration of Japanese culture and political system were central in the 1920s among Filipino intellectuals. In the 1920s, Japan shadowed the erratic years of the Meiji and brought forth a democratic and liberal faith. Its solid political, economic, and military institutions became proof of an Oriental nation capable of overtaking or being in competition with Western nations. Some Filipino academics and politicians even considered Japan's political system as an example worth reviewing because it is the only Oriental country to be modern and free from excessive Western influences. In a speech delivered before the Philippine Society of Japan in Tokyo, President Quezon assured that the future of Japan-Philippine relations, quote, Japan and the Philippines are neighbors, and it is to their mutual interest that they be friends. And friendship can only be promoted through fair dealing and justice on both sides, unquote. He also spoke about peace and cooperation. Quote, I am confident, in fact, it is my earnest endeavor that in the future there will be always be the heartiest cooperation between your people and my people in everything that means the progress and peace not only on this part of the world, but also of mankind in general, unquote. He even reiterated the allegations of the so-called Japanese problem in Davao were unsound and that the Filipino-Japanese relationship in Mindanao is nothing to be concerned about. Although not yet established, we can conclude that Pan-Asianism might be the reason why some Filipinos quickly cooperated with the Japanese during the Second World War. Some veterans of the Philippine Revolution welcomed the inception of the Second Republic in 1943. They have a common enemy, Western imperialism. But this premise, of course, takes further study and understanding. In another work, Kuunyeng Aboitiz has entertained and interrogated this premise through her research of Jose P. Laurel's political thought, which offered good observation related to nationalism and the concept of Pan-Asianism in the context of the Philippines. Going back to preparedness with regard to the coming of the war, the Philippine Commonwealth exerted all effort in the reorganization of the Philippine Army beginning 1936. It is suitable to recognize Quezon's good decision to seek the help of General MacArthur and the Office of the Military Advisor to the Commonwealth Government to ensure the Philippines' national defense. While Filipinos have the experience of organizing their army, as best seen in the Philippine-American War, by 1935, the Philippines do not possess an independent army since 1902. For only a brief time, Filipino forces were organized for the First World War, but did not produce results and were later disbanded. The Philippines, therefore, have been reliant on US troops in the Pacific. The country, however, was still in another dilemma. MacArthur projected that the Philippines would have a standing army of 400,000 by 1946. However, 3 years after the foundation of the Commonwealth Act No. 1, those who received military training stand only less than 70,000. MacArthur's defense plan received doubts among Filipino politicians. This is one of many reasons why Quezon's Commonwealth produced Executive Order 230 of 1939, or the establishment of Department of National Defense. The said EO restricted American assistance and involvement in its formation of national defense. With EO 230, Quezon and the Secretary of National Defense have now full authority in its configuration and development of a Philippine Army and its national defense. This is quite a bold nationalistic move by Quezon. Quezon and the Philippine Commonwealth started to be more independent and not rely on the United States. As Japan continued its expansionist campaign in East Asia, and the Philippines with its reorganization of the Philippine Army, in 1939, President Quezon called on the Filipino youth, quote, "Quite a large sum, considering the present condition of our finances, is being spent every year in the execution of that plan. But the government alone cannot provide an effective defense of our fatherland. Every Filipino citizen must be willing to make the supreme sacrifice when the call to arms is sounded." He further added, "The schools, colleges, universities, public and private, must constantly instill in the minds and hearts of their students their duty to defend the nation in the time of war and to be useful and law-abiding citizens in the time of peace," unquote. But it was too late. Because of the many US bases and significant presence of American fighters in the country, the Philippines still became the main target of Japan's coordinated invasion. Summing up, the Philippine Commonwealth faced many problems, from political to economic to military. Despite our leaders' confidence for self-government, the shared military responsibility with the United States in preparation for a possible war became one of the hindrances in the Philippine Commonwealth's path towards self-determination. Undoubtedly, the Philippines became the frontier of defense of the war in the Pacific in December of 1941. Whether it's the shortcomings of the Filipino leaders or our close ties with the United States, or say Japan's ultra-nationalist goals, the Filipino people showed that despite ill preparation during the Commonwealth period, the valiant Filipino soldiers put up a fight that left a mark in our history that reverberates until today. Thank you very much.